In 1911, the United States Supreme Court delivered what was supposed to be the final blow against the most powerful business empire in American history. Standard Oil, the company John D. Rockefeller had built from a single Cleveland refinery into a near-total monopoly over American oil, was ordered broken into 34 separate companies. Newspapers called it a triumph for democracy. Regulators called it proof that no company, however large, stood above the law. But here's what most retellings leave out. Within months of that ruling, Rockefeller's personal fortune didn't shrink, it surged. Shares in the newly independent companies, the same companies born from his empire's dismemberment, soared in value almost immediately. The man the government had spent over 2 decades trying to stop ended up richer than he had ever been before the breakup even happened. That raises an uncomfortable question. If breaking up the largest monopoly in American history made its founder wealthier, what exactly did the government actually stop? To understand that paradox, we need to go back to the beginning, to a time before antitrust law existed, before regulators knew what they were dealing with, and before anyone understood that the real story wasn't about oil at all. It was about something far more durable than any single company. The story begins in Cleveland, Ohio in 1870, with a young bookkeeper turned industrialist named John D. Rockefeller. At the time, the American oil industry was chaotic, a speculative gold rush of independent drillers and refiners, all competing without coordination, oversight, or any meaningful regulation. There was no antitrust law. There was no federal agency built to monitor corporate consolidation. The government, in a very real sense, had no institutional framework capable of recognizing a threat like the one about to emerge. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil that year with a small group of partners, including Henry Flagler, a disciplined and equally strategic businessman who would become instrumental in the company's early expansion. Unlike many of his competitors, Rockefeller wasn't interested in drilling. He recognized something most of the industry had overlooked. Refining, not extraction, was the true choke point of the entire oil supply chain. Whoever controlled refining could control price, supply, and eventually, the market itself. Within a few years, Standard Oil began quietly absorbing or outcompeting rival refiners across Ohio and beyond. By the mid-1870s, it controlled a significant share of American refining capacity. And this happened almost entirely outside public awareness, because the government of the era simply wasn't structured to notice. But the story of how he got ahead is only half the picture. What he built next wasn't just a business, it was something regulators wouldn't even have a name for until decades later. In 1872, Rockefeller made one quiet decision that had nothing to do with oil prices, drilling rights, or crushing a rival in public. It never made headlines at the time, but historians studying the rise of American monopoly power still point to this single moment as the true turning point, the first time Rockefeller stopped competing in the open market and started rewriting the rules of the game itself. That decision was his involvement in the South Improvement Company, a secret alliance between Standard Oil and several major railroads designed to secure preferential shipping rebates unavailable to smaller refiners. When word of the scheme leaked, public outrage was immediate. Independent oil producers in Pennsylvania revolted. Newspapers condemned the arrangement as corrupt. The South Improvement Company was dissolved within months. By any conventional measure, this should have been a setback. Instead, it became a lesson. Rockefeller learned that visible collusion invited backlash, but quiet consolidation did not. Over the next decade, Standard Oil continued acquiring competitors, often through private negotiations structured to avoid public scrutiny. Then, in 1882, Rockefeller and his partners engineered something genuinely unprecedented, the Standard Oil Trust. This legal structure allowed a small group of trustees to control dozens of nominally independent companies through a shared pool of stock, without those companies technically merging. On paper, competition still appeared to exist. In practice, control was centralized entirely. This mattered enormously because American regulation at the time operated almost exclusively at the state level. No single state had jurisdiction over a structure deliberately built to span state lines while remaining legally ambiguous about who was actually in charge. Every time a state attempted to challenge Standard Oil's practices, the trust structure gave the company just enough legal distance to avoid direct liability. Every time regulators closed one loophole, Rockefeller had already built 3 more. This legal architecture, quiet, deliberate, and specifically designed to outpace the government's capacity to respond, is the real reason Standard Oil managed to operate virtually unchecked for the better part of 2 decades. To understand why the American government struggled for so long to stop Rockefeller, we need to look past the simple label of monopoly and examine the actual mechanics of the system he built, because this wasn't dominance achieved through scale alone. It was dominance engineered through structure. The first mechanism was the trust itself. By separating legal ownership from visible operational control, Rockefeller created genuine ambiguity about accountability. If regulators wanted to challenge anti-competitive behavior, they first had to determine who was legally responsible for it: the individual companies, the trustees, or Standard Oil as a broader entity. That ambiguity alone bought years of legal delay. The second mechanism was jurisdictional fragmentation. Standard Oil operated across dozens of states, but American regulatory power in the late 19th century remained almost entirely state-based. No single state attorney general had the authority to dismantle a nationwide trust. This wasn't an accident. It was a direct exploitation of the gap between where economic power operated and where legal power was actually held. The third mechanism was information asymmetry. Rockefeller was famous, even among his rivals, for his obsessive attention to internal accounting. Standard Oil tracked costs, competitor pricing, and regional market conditions with a level of precision that gave it a persistent informational advantage. While government investigators were still gathering basic facts about the company's structure, Rockefeller's internal teams already understood the market better than anyone attempting to regulate it. The fourth mechanism was economic leverage. By the 1880s, Standard Oil controlled roughly 90% of American oil refining. Its efficiency had genuinely lowered kerosene prices for consumers, the primary fuel used for lighting in American homes at the time. This created a political complication. Aggressive government action against Standard Oil risked disrupting an industry that millions of ordinary Americans depended on for something as basic as light in their homes. Politicians weighing action against Rockefeller weren't just confronting a company. They were confronting the political cost of potentially raising prices on a product every household needed. This is where most explanations stop at the word monopoly. But the deeper issue was structural, not simply commercial. Rockefeller hadn't just built a company that outcompeted its rivals. He had built a system specifically designed to exist in the space between what the law prohibited and what the law had not yet been written to address. The public narrative of the era framed Standard Oil's dominance as a story of efficiency and competitive success, a company simply better run than its rivals. The strategic reality was considerably more deliberate, a structure engineered, adjusted, and refined specifically to remain one step ahead of regulatory capacity at every stage of its growth. It would take investigative journalism, sustained public pressure, and an entirely new category of federal law before the government developed the tools to seriously challenge this system. But by the time those tools existed, Standard Oil had already spent nearly 2 decades operating largely beyond meaningful oversight, and the consequences of that head start had already reshaped the American economy. The turning point in public awareness came not from government investigators, but from journalism. Beginning in 1902, writer Ida Tarbell published a detailed, methodically researched exposé of Standard Oil's business practices, drawing on internal documents and first-hand accounts of the company's rise. Her reporting transformed public perception, turning abstract concerns about monopoly power into a concrete, well-documented narrative that ordinary Americans could understand and react to. That shift in public opinion mattered because it created the political pressure necessary for meaningful legislative action. The Sherman Antitrust Act had actually been passed back in 1890, more than a decade before Tarbell's reporting, explicitly to address concerns about monopolistic consolidation. Yet for years, it remained largely untested against Standard Oil specifically. The law existed, but the government lacked both the political will and the legal precedent to apply it effectively against a structure as sophisticated as the trust. This gap between legislation and enforcement reveals something important. Passing a law and actually stopping entrenched economic power are not the same achievement. It would take until 1911, 21 years after the Sherman Act's passage, for the Supreme Court to finally rule against Standard Oil under its provisions. The consequences of this delay extended far beyond Rockefeller himself. Consumers had genuinely benefited from lower kerosene prices during Standard Oil's rise, a direct result of the efficiencies created by vertical integration and centralized control. But that same efficiency had eliminated competitive markets across the refining industry, concentrating enormous economic power in the hands of a small group of trustees for decades. Independent producers who might otherwise have competed and innovated were systematically absorbed or driven out. Beyond America's borders, Standard Oil's rise became something of a global case study. Foreign governments, observing the company's methods, began developing their own frameworks for corporate regulation, often citing Standard Oil directly as the example of what unregulated consolidation could produce. In this sense, the company's legacy extended well past the oil industry. It helped shape the very concept of modern antitrust law, both domestically and internationally. When historians tally winners and losers from this era, the picture is genuinely complicated. Rockefeller himself, along with the shareholders who held stock through the eventual breakup, emerged wealthier than ever. Consumers had benefited from decades of lower prices, but competitive markets, independent producers, and, perhaps most significantly, the deterrent power of antitrust law itself had all been meaningfully weakened by 20 years of limited enforcement. That question becomes even more pointed when we look at what actually happened after the government's supposed victory in 1911. When the Supreme Court finally ordered Standard Oil dissolved in 1911, the ruling split the company into 34 separate entities, corporations that would eventually evolve into some of the most recognizable names in American energy, including what became ExxonMobil, Chevron, and Marathon Petroleum. On paper, this was the most significant antitrust victory in American history to that point. In practice, the outcome was far more complicated. Rockefeller retained substantial ownership stakes across many of these newly independent companies. As they began trading separately on the stock market, their combined value quickly exceeded what Standard Oil had been worth as a single entity. Rather than diminishing his wealth, the breakup effectively redistributed his empire into more valuable, individually thriving pieces, and Rockefeller's personal fortune grew accordingly, making him, by some historical estimates, the wealthiest individual in modern American history shortly afterward. This outcome invites several interpretations, each carrying weight beyond Rockefeller's specific case. The first is straightforward. Fragmenting a monopoly does not necessarily reduce the wealth of its founder, particularly when that founder retains ownership stakes across the resulting pieces. Breaking up structure does not automatically break up capital. The second interpretation is more structural. Antitrust law, as applied here, proved considerably more effective at altering the form of economic power than at reducing its underlying scale. Standard Oil's operational unity was dismantled, but the wealth and influence it had generated simply reorganized itself into a new configuration. The third interpretation extends this pattern into the present day. Contemporary debates over breaking up dominant technology companies or large energy conglomerates often invoke Standard Oil as historical precedent. Yet the lesson from 1911 suggests a more nuanced reality. Structural separation alone, without addressing ownership concentration, may reshape a company's public form without meaningfully reducing the influence of the individuals or entities who built it. The government had just delivered its biggest antitrust victory in history, and the man they had spent decades trying to stop became measurably wealthier because of it. This brings us back to the paradox we opened with, and forces us to ask what stopping a company like Standard Oil actually meant, both in 1911 and in any similar confrontation between government power and entrenched economic structure since. So how does a government break up the largest monopoly in its history and still watch its founder grow richer? The honest answer is that Rockefeller was never really defeated by antitrust law, not in the way the public narrative of 1911 suggested. He simply operated for over 3 decades in a structural space that the law had not yet been designed to close. By the time the Sherman Antitrust Act finally caught up with him, the wealth, infrastructure, and influence he had built were durable enough to survive and even benefit from the very ruling meant to dismantle them. This is the deeper lesson beneath the story of Standard Oil. It was never really a story about oil, or even about monopoly in the narrow sense. It was a story about what happens when private economic power moves faster than the legal and regulatory systems built to contain it, and about how, even when the law eventually responds, capital often finds new pathways to endure. Today, similar questions surface in debates over dominant technology firms, global energy conglomerates, and corporations whose economic footprint spans borders faster than any single government can regulate. Rockefeller's story suggests that the challenge those debates face isn't new. It's over a century old. The question worth sitting with isn't whether today's regulators have better tools than the ones used against Rockefeller. It's whether, even with those tools, the outcome would actually look any different.